The Spartacus Slave Revolt, 73 to 71 BCE, Rome. In 73 BCE, on the outskirts of Capua, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus led an escape that shook the Roman Republic. Alongside about 70 fellow gladiators, armed only with kitchen knives and improvised weapons, he broke free from his barracks. That desperate dash for freedom ignited one of history's most famous uprisings. What began as a handful of fugitives swelled dramatically. Enslaved men and women fled to join him. Farmers, shepherds, miners, people with no path but defiance. Within months, Spartacus commanded tens of thousands, fighting not only for survival but for the rarest prize in Rome, liberation. For nearly 2 years, his armies outmaneuvered Roman legions. They routed commanders, humiliated generals, and terrified the Senate. At their peak, they may have numbered 120,000 strong, turning the empire's dependence on slave labor into its deepest vulnerability. Yet the rebellion had no single vision. Spartacus is believed to have hoped to lead his followers north over the Alps to freedom. But many chose instead to stay in Italy, raiding its fertile countryside. That pause gave Rome the chance to regroup. General Marcus Licinius Crassus raised a massive, disciplined army. After fierce campaigning in 71 BCE, the revolt was crushed in southern Italy. Spartacus himself likely died fighting, refusing to surrender. Rome made the defeat unforgettable. Over 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the bodies left as a warning to all who might defy Roman order. Though the revolt ended in blood, its legacy endured. To Rome, Spartacus was a criminal. To later generations, he became a lasting symbol of resistance, proof that even the mightiest empire could tremble when those in chains rose together. The Jewish-Roman Wars, 66 to 135 CE, Judea. In the 1st century CE, a small province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire erupted in a series of revolts so fierce that they shook both Judea and Rome itself. These were the Jewish-Roman Wars, spanning almost 70 years, marked by devastation, determination, and one of antiquity's most famous tragedies. The First Great Revolt began in 66 CE, fueled by crushing taxation, religious tension, and resentment toward Roman governors. What started as local unrest soon escalated into full-scale war. Jewish rebels captured Jerusalem, and for a moment it seemed as though they had defied the empire. Rome responded with overwhelming force. The legions of General Vespasian, later emperor, marched relentlessly through Judea. By 70 CE, under his son Titus, Jerusalem itself was besieged. The city fell after brutal fighting, and the Second Temple, the center of Jewish worship, was burned and destroyed. That loss remains one of the most haunting moments in Jewish history. But defiance didn't end there. Resistance continued at strongholds like Mazada, where, according to tradition, hundreds of defenders chose death over capture when the Romans finally breached its walls. Decades later, Rome faced yet another uprising, the Bar Kokhba Revolt of 132 CE. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, rebels once again seized parts of Judea, even re-establishing an independent government for a brief, defiant moment. At its height, Bar Kokhba's forces controlled fortified towns and spread hope of freedom. But Rome returned with overwhelming vengeance. By 135 CE, the rebellion was crushed, Jerusalem was refounded as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, and Jews were banned from entering it. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands perished. Entire communities were destroyed. Yet even in defeat, the memory lived on. The destruction of the temple and the bravery of those who resisted became defining moments of Jewish identity, testaments to both tragic loss and enduring resilience. The An Lushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 CE, Tang Dynasty, China. In the mid-8th century, the Tang dynasty stood as one of the most powerful and sophisticated empires in the world, prosperous, cultured, and seemingly unshakable. But in 755 CE, a single ambitious general shattered that image. His name was An Lushan, and his rebellion would plunge China into a catastrophe that killed tens of millions. An Lushan was no outsider. He was a celebrated military commander of mixed Sogdian and Turkic origin, trusted by Emperor Xuanzong himself. But beneath the courtly favor simmered ambition. In the winter of 755, he turned his armies of more than 100,000 men against the dynasty, marching south from the frontier toward the Tang capital. His revolt was as much about personal power as it was about growing resentment within the empire. Corruption, heavy taxation, and factional disputes all fed the fire. The rebel forces advanced with terrifying speed. Within months, they seized Luoyang, one of China's great capitals, and forced the emperor and his court to flee. Panic swept the empire. What had been the height of Tang glory now descended into chaos and civil war. For 8 brutal years, China was torn apart. Cities were sacked, farmland destroyed, famine spread, and rival warlords joined the fray. Even though An Lushan himself was assassinated by his own son just a few years in, the rebellion spiraled on without him, sustained by shifting loyalties and endless bloodshed. By the time the Tang dynasty restored a tenuous control in 763, the cost was almost unimaginable. Estimates of the death toll reach into the tens of millions, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history. The Tang dynasty survived, but it was permanently weakened. Authority fragmented, military governors gained dangerous autonomy, and the empire never recovered its former brilliance. The An Lushan Rebellion became a turning point, proof that even the most glittering golden age could be undone by ambition, betrayal, and the sheer weight of civil strife. The Zanj Rebellion, 869 to 883 CE, Abbasid Caliphate, Mesopotamia. In the late 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the great Islamic empires of the medieval world, was shaken to its core by a revolt lasting nearly 15 years. It wasn't led by nobles or generals, but by the Zanj, enslaved East Africans forced into brutal labor who rose up under impossible conditions in one of history's longest and most devastating slave revolts. The Zanj had been brought to southern Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, to drain salt marshes. They worked in scorching heat, lived in poverty, and endured constant abuse. By 869 CE, under the leadership of Ali ibn Muhammad, thousands rose in armed rebellion, turning suffering into defiance. At first, local rulers dismissed it as a passing disturbance. But momentum grew. The Zanj captured towns, built fortifications, and even organized a protestate, administering territory and waging campaigns. At their peak, they numbered in the tens of thousands, launching raids that reached dangerously close to Basra, one of the empire's great cities. Defeating them proved enormously costly. The Abbasid state, already weakened by internal strife and political fragmentation, struggled to contain the uprising. For years, battles raged across the marshlands. Only in 883 CE, after punishing campaigns and prolonged sieges, did Abbasid forces finally crush the rebellion and kill its leaders. The toll was staggering: countless deaths, devastated farmland, and ruined cities. Though the Abbasids survived, their prestige was shaken, revealing the fragility of even a mighty empire when those at the bottom rose in fury. The Zanj never secured lasting freedom, but their rebellion endures as a warning. Even the most oppressed can bring empires to the brink of collapse. The Peasants Revolt, 1381, England. In 1381, nearly 40 years after the Black Death devastated Europe, England faced one of the Middle Ages' most dramatic uprisings, the Peasants' Revolt. At its heart was a clash between ordinary villagers, worn down by taxation and hardship, and elites determined to enforce control. The spark came with the poll tax, demanded not once but 3 times in quick succession. After years of labor shortages following the plague, peasants were already resisting wage controls and restrictions on freedom. The tax was the breaking point. In May, villages in Essex and Kent rose, refusing payment and driving away royal officials. What began as local defiance became a mass uprising. Led by Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical preaching of John Bull, thousands of rebels marched on London demanding an end to serfdom, fair rents, and justice against corrupt officials. By June, immense crowds entered the city, unleashing fury. Prisons stormed, tax records destroyed, and the hated Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, executed. The climax came on June 15 at Smithfield, where Tyler met 14-year-old King Richard II. Negotiations faltered. Accounts vary, but Tyler was suddenly struck down and killed by the king's men. Chaos followed, yet Richard rode forward, promising the rebels safety if they dispersed. Many trusted him and laid down arms. It was a fatal mistake. Once the rebels dispersed, Richard revoked his word. Leaders were hunted, villages punished, John Bull executed. The dream of freedom was crushed almost as quickly as it began. Though defeated, the revolt terrified the ruling class. Never before had peasants marched on the capital demanding change. The Peasants' Revolt proved that even the humblest could shake the foundations of power, if only for a fleeting moment. The German Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, Holy Roman Empire. In the early 1500s, the Reformation swept Europe, challenging church authority, spreading new ideas of faith, and sowing change. For peasants in the Holy Roman Empire, those ideals weren't only religious, they meant freedom from crushing taxes, feudal obligations, and centuries of exploitation. Out of this unrest came one of Europe's largest popular uprisings, the German Peasants' War. It began in 1524, when peasants in southwestern Germany refused to submit to their lords, demanding lower rents, fairer treatment, and an end to serfdom. Inspired partly by Reformation talk of spiritual equality, they outlined their grievances in the 12 Articles. Calls for justice spread rapidly by pamphlets and sermons. But petitions soon gave way to rebellion. Armed with farm tools, crude weapons, and desperation, peasants, townsfolk, and sympathetic clergy rallied. At their height, perhaps 300,000 people were involved. They stormed castles, monasteries, and noble estates, striking at a feudal order that had oppressed them for generations. But enthusiasm met brutal reality. The nobility, backed by professional armies, crushed them with cavalry and cannon. Battles turned into massacres, and captured leaders were executed in public as warnings. A devastating blow came from Martin Luther. Though his sermons helped inspire demands, he sided with the princes once violence erupted, condemning rebels and urging rulers to smite them mercilessly. His rejection shattered morale and hardened repression. By 1525, the war was over. As many as 100,000 peasants lay dead, victims of one of Europe's bloodiest uprisings. The feudal order survived, stronger than ever, but the rebellion's memory lingered as a testament to desperation, and a grim warning of what happens when ideals of justice collide with the iron grip of power. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, Qing Dynasty, China. In the mid-19th century, the Qing dynasty looked like an empire on the ropes. Defeats in the Opium Wars, foreign intrusion, natural disasters, and crushing poverty left millions disillusioned. Out of this turmoil came a revolt unlike any other, the Taiping Rebellion, mixing political upheaval with religious fanaticism and ending in devastation on an unimaginable scale. At its center was Hong Xiuquan, a failed scholar from Guangdong. After visions and encounters with Christian teachings, he declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, chosen to purge China of corruption and demons, including the Qing rulers. His message of equality, shared property, and social reform resonated deeply with peasants suffering under poverty and abuse. By 1850, his followers, the Taipings, launched a full-scale revolt. Their discipline, religious zeal, and promise of a heavenly kingdom drew millions. Within a few years, they captured Nanjing, renamed it the heavenly capital, and ruled much of southern China. To many, it looked like a dawning new era. Instead, it spiraled into one of the deadliest civil wars in history. Bitter battles raged between Taiping forces and Qing imperial armies, with Britain and France eventually aiding the dynasty out of fear of instability. The conflict became a nightmare of sieges, famine, massacres, and scorched earth campaigns. Entire regions were emptied of life. By 1864, the rebellion was finally crushed. The cost was staggering, an estimated 20 to 30 million dead, more than most wars in human history. The Qing dynasty survived, but the empire was permanently weakened. Its decline accelerated. The Taiping Rebellion stands as a chilling reminder of how religious vision, charismatic leadership, and mass desperation can combine to unleash destruction on a truly colossal scale. The Sepoy Rebellion, or Indian Rebellion of 1857, British India. In 1857, the jewel of the British Empire nearly slipped away. What began as a mutiny among Indian soldiers, or sepoys, in the East India Company's army erupted into a revolt that shook an empire once thought unshakable. The roots had built for decades. Company rule meant harsh taxes, exploitation of farmers, erosion of traditional rulers, and growing resentment across courts, villages, and especially among sepoys, who endured discrimination and poor treatment under British officers. The spark was small but explosive, new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with beef and pork fat. For Hindus, this defiled sacred beliefs. For Muslims, it violated dietary law. Loading the rifles meant biting the cartridges, a perceived insult. In May 1857, sepoys at Meerut refused, were punished, and soon turned their weapons on British officers. The revolt spread like fire. In Delhi, rebels proclaimed the aging Bahadur Shah II, last Mughal emperor, as a symbolic leader. Across northern and central India, garrisons erupted, towns rebelled, and civilians, peasants, and princes joined in. For a brief moment, British control tottered. Families fled or were massacred, company troops retreated, and districts slipped from their grasp. Yet the revolt was fragmented. Without unified command or strategy, rebels fought bravely but unevenly. The British, reinforced by loyal regiments and superior weaponry, regrouped. By 1858, city after city fell amid brutal reprisals. Villages burned, civilians massacred, thousands executed. The aftermath reshaped India. The East India Company was dissolved, with direct rule passing to the British Crown, beginning the Raj. Though crushed, the rebellion endured as a warning. Even the strongest empire could be challenged when resentment boiled over. To the British, it was a mutiny. To Indians, the first war of independence. Either way, it marked the day Britain learned its empire was not beyond revolt. The Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, Qing China. By the turn of the 20th century, China was under immense strain. Foreign powers had forced humiliating concessions, missionaries spread Christianity, and railways and Western technology cut across old traditions. To many Chinese, their country was being carved up, spiritually and physically. From this anxiety rose the righteous and harmonious fists, known in the West as the Boxers. Composed of peasants, farmers, and martial artists, they combined training with rituals they believed made them bulletproof. To them, foreigners were the source of misery, merchants, missionaries, diplomats, while Chinese Christian converts were branded as accomplices. In 1899, Boxer attacks began sweeping northern China in a wave of anti-foreign violence. At first, the Qing court hesitated, but as the movement expanded and foreign nations demanded suppression, conservative factions sided with the Boxers. By summer 1900, the revolt became open war. Foreigners and Chinese Christians were besieged in the legation quarter of Beijing, enduring weeks of relentless fire. Across the countryside, churches were torched and converts massacred. The global response was swift. The Eight-Nation Alliance, Japan, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the U.S., launched a heavily armed expedition. In August 1900, they broke into Beijing, lifted the siege, and crushed resistance. What followed was brutal executions, looting, and collective punishments against villages accused of aiding the Boxers. By 1901, the Qing dynasty signed the Boxer Protocol, imposing massive indemnities, executions of officials, and permanent foreign garrisons in Beijing. The dynasty endured, but its authority was shattered. Within a decade, revolutionaries rose again, this time ending imperial rule altogether. The Boxer Rebellion remains a haunting collision of tradition and modernity, desperate resistance to foreign domination, and the tragic cost of an empire trapped between past and future. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, Haiti. In the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti, was the wealthiest colony in the world, built on sugar, coffee, and the brutal labor of nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans. Their lives were defined by endless toil and abuse under a small white elite. But in 1791, inspired by desperation and revolutionary ideals from France, they rose in defiance. It began with a massive night uprising, plantations burned, enslavers overthrown. Yet this was no brief revolt. Over the years it became a revolution, a war that ended slavery and toppled colonial power. At its heart stood figures like Toussaint Louverture, a former slave turned brilliant general and statesman. He forged disciplined armies from those once treated as property, defeating repeated French campaigns and even outmaneuvering Spain and Britain, who sought to seize the colony. France, desperate to hold its prize, abolished slavery in 1794, but the struggle continued. When Napoleon Bonaparte later tried to restore slavery and retake the island, Haitian fighters stood firm. On November 18, 1803, at the Battle of Vertières, they crushed French forces. By 1804, Saint-Domingue declared independence as Haiti, the world's first black republic and the only successful large-scale slave revolt in history. The cost was staggering, hundreds of thousands died, and the new nation faced isolation, boycotts, and crushing debt imposed by colonial powers terrified of its example. Still, Haiti's revolution reshaped the world, frightening slave-holding societies, inspiring abolitionists, and proving freedom could be won through rebellion. The Haitian Revolution was more than defiance. It was a rebirth, when the enslaved not only broke their chains but forged a nation that refused ever to return to bondage. The 1916 Easter Rising, Ireland. In the spring of 1916, while Europe was mired in World War I, Ireland staged its own battle for freedom. On Easter Monday, April 24th, a small band of nationalists rose against British rule in Dublin. Though doomed militarily, their defiance would spark a chain of events that changed Ireland forever. The rebels were drawn from the Irish Republican Brotherhood, Irish Volunteers, and the Irish Citizen Army. With barely 1,200 fighters, they seized key sites across Dublin, the General Post Office, government buildings, and other strongholds. From the steps of the GPO, Patrick Pearse read the proclamation of the Irish Republic, declaring independence. For the first time in centuries, the dream of a free Ireland was openly voiced. Britain reacted swiftly. Thousands of troops poured into the city, artillery bombarded rebel positions, and street battles raged for 6 days. Whole blocks of central Dublin were reduced to rubble, civilians caught in the crossfire. By April 29th, overwhelmed and exhausted, Pearse ordered surrender. At first, many Irish citizens resented the rebels for the devastation. But that anger shifted after the reprisals. 15 leaders, including Pearse and James Connolly, executed while tied to a chair, were shot by firing squad. Their death transformed public opinion. The rebels were no longer viewed as reckless dreamers, but martyrs for freedom. Though the Easter Rising failed militarily, its political legacy was immense. Outrage at the executions fueled nationalist sentiment, and within 5 years, the Irish War of Independence had begun. The Rising proved a simple truth. Sometimes failure on the battlefield plants the very seeds that blossom into revolution. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, 1943, Nazi-occupied Poland. In the spring of 1943, in the heart of Nazi-occupied Warsaw, a small group of Jewish fighters launched one of the most desperate rebellions of World War II. It unfolded not on open battlefields but within the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto, a place of starvation, disease, and mass deportations to extermination camps. By then, hundreds of thousands had already been sent to Treblinka, when nearly none returned. The remaining Jews knew deportation meant death. Instead of waiting, they chose to fight. On April 19, 1943, as German forces entered to conduct more deportations, they were met by unexpected resistance. Smuggled firearms, Molotov cocktails, and improvised bombs rained on the attackers. Many fighters, teenagers or young adults, had no illusion of victory. Their aim was not conquest, but to resist annihilation and prove the Jewish people would not go silently. The Germans answered with overwhelming violence. Tanks, flamethrowers, and artillery leveled building after building. Civilians hid in bunkers while the fighters battled amid rubble. For nearly a month, resistance held out until May 16, when the last strongholds collapsed and the Nazis symbolically demolished Warsaw's Great Synagogue. Almost all fighters perished, and most surviving civilians were killed or deported. Yet the rebellion achieved something extraordinary. Against hopeless odds, it became a lasting symbol of courage, dignity, and defiance in the face of absolute horror. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising reminds us that rebellion is not always about seizing power or land. Sometimes, it is about refusing to surrender one's humanity, even when surrounded by fire, ruin, and despair.